Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back. Just before we get started, the Atlantic Coaching Conference Committee would like to acknowledge that our offices are located in Mi'kmaq, the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Treaties of Peace and Friendship, which Mi'kmaq and Wuastigi peoples signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Wistuli title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship. We are aware that there are participants online joining us from all over Turtle Island and welcome each of you to share where you currently reside. We honor Mi'kmaq people who have taken care of this land, and at CSCA we show respect for this land and work to make sure we keep taking care of it for all of us. We are all treaty people. So we hope you enjoyed the first breakout sessions of the conference. I personally was privileged to get to sit in on the session with Greg Henhock and learned quite a bit of different things on Indigenous culture that I will certainly reflect on moving forward. Before I introduce Aisha, just a couple of housekeeping notes. For those joining our awesome in-person session tonight, please meet us outside the turnstiles at the Canada Game Center for 5:45, and we will walk you in. We will have a light dinner for you upon your arrival. For those joining us tomorrow, number one, I personally can't wait to see you in person, but more importantly, there will be coffee ready for you because we all are going to need it because we want to be up and going for the start of our day when you arrive at the Hampton Inn. And our first session starts at 8:30 sharp. For this afternoon's keynote, we ask that you turn your camera and microphone off for the duration of the talk. Sarah, Kirsty, and myself will be monitoring questions throughout the chat and throughout the Whova app as well. Now, with all of that out of the way, let me introduce this afternoon's keynote speaker and a good friend of mine, Aisha Santish. Aisha is a certified health coach and the founder and owner of Me to Moi Health. With over 15 years of experience in mental health, accessibility, and diversity and inclusion, Aisha has used her experience as a strategic advisor and health coach to understand the complexity and intersectionality of the mental, physical, emotional, and spiritual barriers that keep people from achieving their optimized health and wellness. Aisha also holds a master's in public policy administration and law, as well as a certification in change management, advanced crisis intervention, and counseling and health coaching as well. She is also an integral master for the Canadian Olympic Committee of Canada, and most recently she became a published author. Aisha, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon at ACC. The virtual stage is yours.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. It's so cool to see how many people are joining today's conversation. Good afternoon. All right, let me get my screen going. All right, can we see my screen? Yeah, all right, excellent. So again, it is an absolute pleasure to be here with all of you this afternoon. I certainly want to thank Andrew and of course all the organizers of this year's 2022 Atlantic Coaches Conference for the opportunity to be here. And what an absolutely amazing opportunity it is really to come together and explore opportunities for real systemic, organizational, and personal change. And of course, before I always begin any of these talks or keynotes, it's really also important for me to acknowledge the land that I'm on. And so I'll be doing an ancestral acknowledgement, of course, that locates myself, pays respect to the territory that I'm on, and provides recognition that we are all settlers on this land. And so I'm located in the Greater Toronto area, land which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among the Mississaugas people, and is the traditional treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation. I hold deep gratitude for the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Attawandarong, the Métis, and the many Indigenous communities who've lived on Turtle Island for thousands of years, and whose land you and I have the privilege of earning a living, playing, and working on. This territory is also understood to be mutually covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy, the Ojibwe, and other allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. And as we gather on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walk before us, and all of the wonderful elements of creation that exist. And may we use this time and reflection to consider whose land we live on, our relationship with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and how we engage in our own responsibility for truth and reconciliation. I also acknowledge all treaty peoples, including those who came here as settlers, as migrants, either in this generation or in generations past. And for those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly forcibly displanted Africans, brought here because of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. And so today I pay tribute to my ancestors of African origin and descent. And for you ancestors, I do this work, and I acknowledge those who are no longer with us. And so let's begin, right? Why are we all here? Why am I here, right? I'm here to begin a culture shift within your respective organizations. I'm here to cause a bit of good trouble, as so powerfully put by the late John Lewis. I'm here to ignite torches that each and every one of you will carry, and that will remain the burning flame for those you work with, you mentor, you coach, you lead, and you support. I am here to lovingly ease you out of the comfort zone and into a place that can be uncomfortable, but where real change not only exists, but where it flourishes. I am here to engage you in some unlearning so that we can create space for new learning, understanding, and opportunity. And lastly, but most importantly, I'm here to guide you through your individual and collective responsibility to the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Because let's keep things real, because this is how I like to operate. We can no longer hide behind the words such as "I didn't know," "I wasn't aware," "it wasn't brought to my attention." Has this always been the case? Right? As leaders of your respective organizations, and rest assured, no matter what your position is, you are all leaders in your own right. We have a responsibility to take ownership of our own learning, understanding, and capacity to affect the kind of change we desire to see. And so I want to set both the expectation and the rules of engagement for our time together. Right? Because my role as your presenter or your facilitator isn't to tell you how to make your organizations more equitable, diverse, or inclusive. My role is to give you the building blocks and the tools by which you will dismantle, plan, and recreate what your future structure looks like. Right? Your role is to enter into this space with a willingness to not just hear, but to do introspective work in the ways that you may be supporting or creating barriers to an equitable, diverse, and inclusive space, right? The ways in which you may be participating in creating these equitable and diverse spaces, right? Understanding that our respective dimensions of diversity, which go far beyond what we see at first glance, shape our perspectives, our opinions, and lived experiences. And so what I ask of you today is to accept the truths of those who share experiences that may be different to yours. Be willing to hear and empathize with people who have and continue to experience systemic barriers, and commit to doing this work beyond this conference. Because real talk, the real work of equity, diversity, and inclusion doesn't begin in these conferences. The work begins the minute the curtains close and you're left to your own vices to make decisions that impact those who you've committed to support, to mentor, to educate, and to empower. So today's workshop isn't just about sitting here and taking in information and watching slides and then leaving. Really, this is not what this whole conference is about, right? Today, it's about going to work. As I said, the effect, the kind of transformative change I think that we're all looking to engage in, which is why we're participating in this conference today, is really to explore all the opportunities and the power that we possess to affect the kind of change, again, that we want to see. Right, so for our agenda, I'm really going to be speaking about 4 building blocks that, in my opinion, are key areas that require exploration and understanding when shifting an organization who's really committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I might be using the word EDI just so that I don't have to continue to say equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's just a shortened way of saying it. And so building block number 1 is about defining safe spaces, right? So when we begin this journey, we often are inclined to turn that EDI switch on and look for those actions or activities that outwardly demonstrate our commitment to this work, right? And while that is important, if the breeding ground by which this work is to foster and grow is not conducive and maintaining a safe space, then what is the use of the actions that we look to put into place, right? One of the first things that must be addressed or established is the creation of a safe space, right? So as you heard, I'm one of the leadership coaches for the Canadian Olympic Committee, and I've had the privilege of reading that safe sport policy, right, which is almost like a novel, right? It provides an understanding and expectation of coaches, volunteers, athletes, the board, and pretty much anyone who's engaged in any sort of activity connected to the sport, right? This is a very important policy for the safety of everyone. But when I speak of safe spaces in this context, I'm talking about the literal and figurative space by which any one person feels a sense of safety, belonging, and has the capacity to self-actualize without diminishing any dimension of who they are for the greater good, right? Creating a safe space promotes and supports those within the organization to speak up and out on things that we know, we feel, we see, we believe do not align with the principles of the sport and our organization. And again, what you all seek to demonstrate outside of your own four walls, right? Further to that, a safe space is one where anyone has the freedom to bring an issue forward, to someone who they feel, or bring up something that they feel, is engaging in actions and or behaviors that may be discriminatory, racially motivated, misogynistic, or harmful to the safety and well-being to themselves, another person, or a group of people without fear of reprisal or reprimand. And so a safe space is also a space of comfort and safety for those who often face discrimination in our society, right? This is certainly not a task that can be completed in one day, right? But the following are some things that can be done to begin this shift into the type of environment, again, that you're all desiring within your respective organizations. So first is establish ground rules or rules of engagement, right? So I want you to think about this. As coaches, as leaders, as trainers, and as administrative supports, I'm sure each of you have really great clarity on what is expected of you regarding your respective roles, as well as the ways in which you will interact and engage with your colleagues, your clients, your students, your leaders, and the public, right? Whether written or just understood, there are rules of engagement. And so as you delve into the work of equity, diversity, and inclusion, we must look to develop such rules that will ensure that all players are aware of, at the very least, the minimum expectation they must enter a space to ensure a safe space. The second is promote dialogue, right? How many of you, whether it was in a meeting you were leading or participating in, have experienced that like really awkward, almost deadly silence where you're hoping somebody says something? Again, perhaps one of the greatest fears of any facilitator, probably a comedian, we're not comfortable with that silence, right? But again, in a safe space, the intent is not to be silent. It's actually quite the contrary. It's one where dialogue must be dialed up and where every single person in the room contributes. The third, which is a really hard one, but takes time, but can be done, is about building trust. Right now, trust is a tricky one because it's not built solely on the assumption that the people in the space are to be trusted, but it is 100% contingent on the actions and inactions that reflect your commitment to building trust and being trustworthy. And so in other words, trust does require time. The next one is don't be afraid to get into uncomfortable conversations. I mean, I don't know about you, right? I mean, I certainly don't go out of my way seeking discomfort or uncomfortable conversations, but it's not anything that we can avoid, right? It's something that is essential to creating a safe space. It absolutely is important because really it's in that mess where change actually starts to happen. Change doesn't happen in status quo. Change doesn't happen in those incremental changes where we expect larger outcomes. It actually has to happen in the space of discomfort. And so creating a space for such, uncomfortable conversations really demonstrates a willingness to disrupt status quo in the name of change, right? The next one is use deep listening. This means we aren't just listening to hear what is being said, but to understand and to explore perspectives that are not ours. Right? Really important when we're looking at delving into, again, safe spaces and really shifting our organizations to becoming more equitable, diverse, and inclusive. The sixth one is sit with what is. Right? Our natural human instinct dictates that in situations or scenarios of discomfort, our instinct is to fix or mend, right? We hear someone's in trouble, they're experiencing discomfort, something has happened. Our natural instinct is to try to go to a solution. But to just sit with what is to actively be with the person you are holding space for, right? Resisting any urge to do anything other than creating safety for others to express themselves freely and without fear that the discomfort of others will now become the focus. That's really, really important. The last one is be self-reflective, right? All of the above steps I've just mentioned, right, are all steps that we need to take in order to create safe spaces and equitable spaces, right? And if we don't, it kind of becomes null and void if we don't see ourselves as part of the bigger picture, right? We can't be on the outside looking in. We must actively be a part of the equation in order to create the safe spaces that we're seeking for our organizations, for ourselves, and for those who are often marginalized and don't feel safe to do so, right? These 7 actions that I've discussed aren't new. I mean, many of you are probably engaged in them. They're actively playing out in your organizations. The significance and the impact, though, of these actions is dictated by your commitment to make this the way you do business, right? So not just today, not just tomorrow, not even just for the remainder of 2022, but actively on a go forward basis. Building block number 2, the power of language. So there's this amazing quote by Angela Carter that says, language is power, life, and the instrument of culture, the instrument of domination and liberation. So words have power, right? Based on our disposition, our body language, our tone, our pitch, our status, even the time of day can change the significance of a word. You see, when we utter words, whether it is to spread love or hopefully, not hopefully, or hate, which hopefully we're not, it affects us all, right? Words influence others and build relationships at work and personally, and therefore they can tear down relationships, but they can also mend them. So simply put, language holds massive, colossal power to manifest change, whether it's good or bad, right? Words are invisible weapons, right? They can shatter dreams or they can build them. They can uplift the soul or tear it down. Words carry more than sounds and meaning. They carry power. And so when we bring that understanding into the space of inclusion and seek to create equitable, diverse, and safe spaces, we really need to acknowledge how one word or even one sentence can change the trajectory of a seemingly good environment and our relationship, right? Language has immense power and its impact depends entirely on how we wield it. And so because words are so often used automatically and unconsciously, we've learned to treat them lightly, right? In daily conversations, we speak most of our words from habit, from convenience and social obligation, rather than from a clear intent. And this is sometimes where we may be engaging in practices, actions, and or behaviors that appear the opposite to what we've openly stated we are working against. And so I want to take a moment to talk about microaggressions as a means of bringing clarity where our unconscious and unintentional harm can be counteractive, right, to what it is that we're actually trying to do. Right, so I'm sure most of you, or if not all of you, right, have heard the term microaggression, right? The term microaggression, which originated in the 1970s by Chester Pierce, an African-American professor of education and psychiatry at Harvard University, is a term that is generally discussed from the perspective of race and racism, right? But it refers to the slights, the put downs, and invalidating remarks that are directed toward a member of any marginalized group, including the LGBTQ+ community, women, religious minorities, immigrants, and people with disabilities, right? Microaggressions are those subtle ways of showing one's bias and discriminating tendencies. right? Any statement or joke or inappropriate inquiry alluding to someone's gender, their race, or age can be a sign of a microaggression, especially if it's said in the context of one's weakness, right? These are often overlooked behaviors that cause so many people to feel excluded and or less than, right? With microaggressions, the tone tells you that these aren't intended to be compliments, right? I'm sure many of you, if I were to take a vote, if I asked you how many of you have had a paper cut, right? It's pretty much probably everyone. And you only discover that you have a paper cut when you wash your hands and it stings, right? But, if you were to get tons of paper cuts daily, right, we know how painful it would be. And so microaggressions are actually nicknamed death by 1,000 paper cuts, meaning if you get a little paper cut a few times a day, every single day, the pain is quite significant, right? It's also really important for us to understand that micro at the beginning of the word microaggression isn't a measurement of the size or equality of those, of those offenses. It signals that this type of aggression takes place on the individual level versus the macro level, which is more structural and systemic. And so I want to also take it one step further, right? In talking about three drill down areas or concepts from the term microaggression, and add micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations, right? So a micro assault are explicit and intentional behaviors intended to hurt a person, such as name calling, avoidance, overt discrimination. We have micro insults, which refers to communication conveying a hidden insult, demeaning a characteristic of a person. And then you have micro invalidations, which are characterized by denial, exclusion, invisibility of a person's thoughts, their feelings and experiences as they relate to a person's marginalized identity. Now, why are these concepts so important in this discussion and certainly in ensuring a safe space? Often someone who may find themselves engaging in these types of behaviors may not even recognize that what they're doing is discriminatory, right? Except for a few people in this world who really do make it their business, right, to be outright rude and discriminatory. Most people do not seek to offend, right? The problem with these microaggressions is that we may be unknowingly engaging in harmful actions under the guise of being kind, right? So as an example, when I first moved to Toronto, because I'm actually originally from Montreal, I worked for a shelter that supported women and children who were fleeing domestic violence. One of the many occasions I had to attend a fundraiser that was happening on behalf of the shelter. And what we used to have to do is, people would give different donations and whoever the rep was would have to go and just say a few words of thanks, depending on what the scenario was. And so in this case, I was the one who had an opportunity to go. And in this space, at the time, this was years ago, was the only Black woman in this space. And so I am, in my 20s, entering into a fairly affluent neighborhood. Again, being the only Black woman, went up and just, said my thank yous and showed gratitude for what they had done, which was quite extensive as a fundraising for the women and children within the shelter. And when I finished, a group of women, approached me to, just express their thanks. And one of the women said to me, oh my, your parents must be so proud of how articulate you are, right? You're definitely an exception to the rule. Now, when I retell that story, in my current state of mind, in my, as a grown adult, fully aware of who I am, right? Grounded in what I know I bring to the table and knowing that, in fact, I'm not an exception to the rule when it comes to my community, right? That young 20-something-year-old woman knew that what had been said was quite discriminatory in nature, understanding that the intent wasn't to cause harm, but it did. But not only did I not have the words to speak up, I also didn't feel like I had the agency to do so, right? And so when we make someone an exception, or when we, again, we have to be mindful around how we're trying, our intention behind, again, trying to offer a kudos, right? But making someone an exception to the rule when it comes to their race or their gender or their ethnicity or their age, their sexual orientation, religious affiliation is not a compliment, right? It's a microaggression. The intent may not be to offend, right? I certainly don't think she came out the gate as a means to offend, but actually to offer accolades, right? But it was a microaggression. It was offensive. right? And so if someone tells you that what they've said, that what you've said is offensive, it's really important. You know, we each have a responsibility and requirement to hear that. And again, that's why the discussion around language is so important, because words have power. And so I know in the Whova, there was some polling questions. I don't know that everyone had a chance to do them, but you know, it's always really important for the purposes of education and discussion to kind of bring it forward. So I don't know if I'm the one who wants to pull up the polling question. Polling question number 1, which I can definitely do. Oh, look at that. So it says a cashier purposefully skips over an Asian customer in line to serve a white guest. Is that a micro assault, a micro insult, or a micro invalidation? Still a few more. All right, we could probably extra. I know sometimes not everyone always answers the polls. All right, so we have micro assault. Right, so this is an example of a micro assault. It was intentional, it was intended to be discriminatory, and it was an intentional act. All right. So the next one, you tell your teammate or your colleague that they're so articulate, and or a person you assume to be from a foreign country that their English is so good. Again, is this a micro assault, a micro insult, or a micro invalidation? Okay, so let's see, there's a few more. All right, yeah, so the result, that is correct. It is a micro insult, right? So this is an example, you know, it's insensitive and it reveals the underlying bias, right, that many people hold, right, for a particular country if it sounds like that they don't speak well. So you stereotyped a community or then told the person, you know, to their face, that they're the exception to the community, right? So this happens sometimes in workplaces. Again, even the most well-intentioned people think that they're being complimentary when in fact they are causing harm, right? So the next one, you know, you tell a joke that has a racist undertone, but then say, I'm just joking, right? Is that a micro assault, a micro insult, or a micro invalidation? one's a little bit more even. All right, that we might have hit the max. So this one is a micro assault, right? Again, the intent is to cause harm, right? At this stage of the game, I think we all are all aware that telling a racist joke is not funny, nor is it appropriate. So that is a micro assault. Our last one is you're in a group of people and someone asks someone else who's, clearly a visible minority where they're from. And when that person says Canada, that same person says, no, I want you to really tell me, where are you really, really from? Is that a micro assault, a micro insult, or a micro invalidation? Okay. So this one's a little bit tricky, but yes, those of you who answered, it's a micro invalidation is correct, right? So the intent wasn't necessarily to cause harm, but the persistence of the question is based on that person's assumption that because they look differently, that they can't be, in this case, Canadian, right? So a judgment was solely based on their marginalized identity, nothing else, right? And so the easiest way to distinguish, the three is that a micro assault is clearly offensive. The intent is to cause harm and to be discriminatory in nature. With micro assaults and micro invalidations, the person on the receiving end may feel insulted, but may not may not be sure as to why. And the perpetrator will not necessarily acknowledge that anything has happened because the intent wasn't, the intent wasn't to be offensive. Now there's no hierarchy. So it's not like I'm saying, hey, engage in micro invalidation over micro assault. Like they're all bad across the board. But really, again, it's to have an understanding around, again, our intent and how our intent, though, can be positive, and not ill-intended, can have a negative effect on someone else, which is, again, what makes the power of words and language so significant, right? And the importance of really listening and hearing if someone does share with you, or that if it's brought up within the organization, that language that we're using is not appropriate, even if we don't feel it to be so. And so now we move to building block number 3. Right? Understanding the dimensions of diversity. So whether this is a new space for you, which I don't really think it is for most of you or all of you, one that you're familiar with, right? Understanding the depths of diversity can have a significant impact on how your organizations continue with this work, right? So looking beyond, again, what we see at face value, right? Diversity really refers to the variety of similarities and differences among people, right? Often called these diversity dimensions. So that includes, but it's not limited to, our gender, our sex, our gender identity and expression, ethnicity, race, indigenous identity and origin, age, generation, ability, sexual orientation, culture, religion, belief system, marital status, parental status, pregnancy status, socioeconomic status and caste, our appearance, language and accent, mental health, education, geography, nationality, work style, work experience, job role and function, thinking style, and personality, right? Our diversity dimensions are quite extensive and absolutely go beyond what it is that we see at face value. So our dimensions shape the way we see and experience the world, how we engage with other groups, how we build and foster relationships, where we feel greater allyship and safety, and they give insight into where we may have conscious or unconscious blind spots. So on the screen before you, you see there's 3 columns, and I want you to look at each list under each column, and I want you to select one item per column and write it down, right? If you're willing to share in the chat, that would be absolutely amazing. I'll use myself as an example. So I am a middle class extrovert with a master's degree, right? So I want you to pick one of these items under each category. And again, if you're willing to share, it's always cool to see who's joining us. I'll open up my chat. Sometimes it's hard to pick just one thing. Thank you, Darren. So middle class, married and Christian, a business owner, a sibling, 26. All right. Middle class, bilingual, Black man, introvert, and a master's degree. Class married, native tongue, middle class, married white woman. Very cool. Keep them coming. Middle class parent, 49. Middle class sibling, married. All right, keep them coming, right? But what I want you to think about, right, is that there's a culture, right? There's a way of seeing the world that is associated with each of these things that you wrote down, right? So for an example, if you were raised in a particular religion, but don't attend services anymore, don't really pray anymore, right? That's also a part of your identity and has an impact on how you see the world, right? Each of these elements on the list is associated with a set of values and beliefs and norms of behaviors and assumptions and expectations on how we see the world, how we want the world to see us, how we interact with the world, how we expect the world to, again, receive us. And as such, there are ways in which our blind spots and those acts of implicit bias can sometimes unintentionally creep up, again, because we're working within a particular lens based on our dimensions of diversity. And so looking at your statement, I now want you to select only one of those 3 dimensions that you feel is the most influential in your life, right? So I see, I'm in the military, I'm a godparent and two-spirited Indigenous person, right? I want you to select which is one that you feel is the most influential in your life. All right. Black, all right. Native. Business owner, all right. Parent and grandparent. Sometimes single mom, healthy, active women. Nice, mom. Very cool. Business owner, okay. I'm gonna try and open up my screen to see if I can do this. Hold on. All right. So now, I know many of you are actually off screen, so I can't necessarily see you, but I want you to use, that hand up. So I want you to tell me if you selected, with a show of hands again, using that emoji, raise your hand if you selected your most influential dimension from column number 1. I'm going to open up my screen so I can see. All right, so we have, so hold on, I see there's a few pages here. Okay. All right. So if you can put your hands down, thank you. And so who selected their most influential identity, or the thumbs up? That's a really good one. Thank you, Doug. I didn't realize that was an option as well. Who selected their most influential identity from column number 2? You can put your hand up or thumbs up. Okay, so there's a few more. Okay, a little bit more. Christian, you can always say if it's column 1, column 2, or column 3. It's all good.
Okay, column 2.
Okay, no problem. Wicked, thank you. Excellent. Okay, so I'm seeing also if you were not able to figure it out, it's difficult, you can also put it in the chat. And so put your hands on, and I want to know who selected their most influential from column number 3. Put your hands up, thumbs up, or you can put it in the chat. All right. All right, so it's a good number. All right. Good number. All right. So if you were observing, right, through this exercise, and you can put your hand down, thank you so much, right? What you'll start to notice, right, without identifying, and I know some of you did identify, so I thank you for that, right? What you start to notice is that there's far more commonalities than there are differences when we move past what it is that we see at face value, right? So the way the brain works is, human researchers or brain researchers actually identify that the human mind takes in 11 million pieces of information per second, right? But through our senses, we actually only hold on to 40 pieces of information, just a slight discrepancy. So we're receiving 11 million messages per second, and we only hold on to 40, right? So the brain seeks to be efficient and is always trying to save energy. And so as a result, what it does is it creates these mental maps, right? To include kind of these automatic associations, these perceptions, these assumptions that can ultimately result in unconscious bias, right? Have you ever driven home? And I see some of you are driving, and you get into your driveway and you absolutely have no idea how you got home. Like, were you actually panicking? You think like, did I even stop at a stop sign? Did I like speed through a school zone? Like, how did I even leave my driveway, right? It's so automatic, right? What we call that is mindless messaging, right? It's a way that the brain prioritizes something in the conscious mind and maybe it might be thinking about while placing the rest in the unconscious mind. And so if we don't bring true understanding of the complexity of diversity and all of the dimensions that make up any one person, then we really do risk mindless, messaging, right? We risk developing programs and creating marketing campaigns and missing out on engagement opportunities because the lens by which we are believing we're being diverse is actually only one dimensional, right? So we really have to understand that we are far more, again, than just what we see, right? And who even found it difficult to even select just one, right? I asked you to identify one per column, and then I said select one, right? If you found it difficult, the reality is because we are made up of all dimensions that make up who we are. We aren't just one dimension, right? Remember, when we started this presentation, one of the things I said was that a safe space is one where all of who we are can be expressed, can be showcased, can be acknowledged, can be seen, can be included, can be shown, right? A safe space cannot exist if we first don't understand that we are beyond what we see before us, right? Checking our biases, checking the assumptions that that we make, being mindful of our language and those little innuendos that are not intended to cause harm, but also do require us, a safe space to speak without fear of reprisal. And so one of the most common things, that I hear when it comes to shifting the culture or an organization, towards a more diverse, equitable, inclusive space is the fear associated sometimes with this process. I'm aware that we've really entered into a very heightened society, right? Who's literally prepared to cancel just about anyone if they don't get the answer right the first time, or if they don't use the right language at the gate. And I certainly appreciate that fear, right? Which is why oftentimes we stay silent, but we have to push past that fear. And we have to also not allow it to be an excuse as to why we aren't taking empowered action in creating these equitable, diverse, and inclusive spaces, right, within our organizations. Look, we need to get past the idea that we have complete control over what happens outside of our four walls, because the reality is we don't, right? This is an issue that also is larger and is entrenched in a lot of historical, structural, and systemic barriers. But what we do have control over is how we individually set the tone and minimum expectations around what is and is not acceptable, right? There should be no blurred lines. And so that brings me to the fourth block, right? Safety to speak, right? A little while ago, you heard me talk about, again, the power of words and how the utterance, tone, place, and space in which we release our words can shape the experience of someone on the receiving end, right? But what happens if your words cause harm or hurt? Whether it's intentional or unintentional, what is your responsibility to address the issues in a safe and respectful way? Right? With a show of hands, right? Who enjoys a lovely, uncomfortable conversation? If someone raises their hand, then you need to teach me, right, what it means, like loving an uncomfortable conversation. I'm going to assume the hands that are up are those that are left, not the ones that actually are saying that they enjoy an uncomfortable conversation, but none of us do, right? No one wants to enter into a tense space where there's awkwardness and a discussion that we would personally not like to have, but it's a fact of life. And because it is also such a part of adulting and a part, again, of creating the kind of equitable, diverse, and inclusive spaces that we want, then we got to get comfortable with it, right? We have to explore how we safely engage in these conversations in a way that we address the problem at hand and at that moment. And I do want to offer a caveat, right? There are certainly situations that have perhaps already happened or that may take place, hopefully they don't, that will require escalation and a collaborative approach. But this discussion is to reduce the spilling over of an issue or an incident that can be addressed at the moment. And so one of the first things we need to do is we need to prepare for the conversation. And when I say prepare, I don't mean like write a speech, like what you're going to say, but I mean, but making sure that you're self-reflecting before you enter into this conversation, which means stepping into that other person's shoes, really understanding what it is that they may be sharing, right? Understanding that there's a different perspective to yours, and so that you can get to an actual conclusion or an outcome, right? Without properly preparing for the conversation. Sometimes it's possible, right, that this tough talk can end in hurt feelings and become even bigger than how it started. And so it's really important to examine how you're feeling about the situation before you enter into this conversation so that your emotions don't arise, right? We're not acting from an emotional perspective, but from fact and with a willingness to hear. The second is, of course, consider the situation from the other person's perspective, right? Now, I'm just going to put this out here straight up, right? There is no consideration to be had for any interaction that we know is racist or discriminatory in practice, right? There's no other side to that. Does that mean that the conversation may not happen? No, but we have to be mindful of offering that other perspective when we know things are very blatantly disrespectful, discriminatory, or racist in action or behavior. So if someone brings something to you from that perspective, or from their perspective that was hurtful or harmful, even if the intent was not to cause harm, right? We have an obligation to acknowledge that what was done or said resulted in negative feelings. And so you may not fully understand or even agree with their perspective, but it is important that you listen, you reflect, and you acknowledge. The third, and this is a really hard one, is to accept criticism and or feedback, right? How many of you, again, you can raise your hands, have children, right? Or even nieces or nephews, or just children in your life, right? Right? There's probably going to be a few times I'm going to go through like this, right? There's quite a few of us, right? Now, what is the number one saying or words kids use when they're held accountable for literally anything, right? What do they say, right? You tell them, they're like, okay, but like, that's not what happened. That you're being unfair. That's not what I meant to do, right? I've been told, even by my 6-year-old son, that I'm no longer permitted to be his mother because I've held him accountable for something that he's been done. A little bit extreme, but again, if you have young children, they're prepared to do whatever, right? How easy is it for all of us to get defensive when someone brings something up we don't want to hear, or that we're uncomfortable with, that we disagree with, or that we think is being misinterpreted or misunderstood? Most of us acknowledge that the reason you are in this difficult conversation is because you may have made a mistake, right? The intention behind your action will be explored within the conversation. But by not acknowledging a level of wrongdoing, you're already creating this blockade, right? That makes resolution difficult, right? Now that, again, that doesn't mean that you allow someone to lambaste you or to disrespect you or attack you, but be willing to hear and receive the critique. The next is don't feel the need for total victory, right? So human nature, again, dictates that comfort comes from agreement. If all parties agree, then it means we have victory. Do not mix consensus for acceptance. The complexity and intersectionality of who we are shapes our values and beliefs, right? While we may strive for fulsome agreement as a demonstration of success, actual success exists in the respect that each party has for the opinion shared by the other, right? I don't need, Andrew necessarily to agree with me, but I need to know that my opinion, my experience, my perspective has been considered, holds value, weight, and merit. The last piece of the puzzle is have a goal in mind, right? Often when we are hurt by someone, our natural instinct is to reciprocate that pain, right? Whether that be telling everyone what someone said or did, or uttering hurtful and harmful comments back to that person, reciprocating in that way doesn't vindicate us, right? Nor are we necessarily justified. And so identifying a goal assists not only in the way we approach this conversation, but it ensures that the individuals are actively engaged, again, in unlearning and now learning new ways of engagement. Right? Over the last hour, almost hour, I think, I'm always watching time, right? We've talked extensively, right, about the creation of safe spaces, what tools, look like, or, what this looks like, right? The power of language and how our words can offend or cause hurt, certainly unintentionally, right? We explored the dimensions of diversity and how we're probably more connected on deeper levels that go beyond what we see within our eyes, right? And we touched on the importance of speaking up and engaging in difficult conversations that support safe and equitable and inclusive spaces. And so as we bring this workshop to a close, I want to get to the real T of this presentation, and that is you, right? You being every single person watching this presentation live, and for those, who may be watching it later, you are the game changer and the catalyst by which everything we talked about will be initiated. While we can explore the review of policies and procedures and practices at length, which are important, we can enhance our recruitment processes for our boards and leadership and staff, right? We can change up our marketing and social media campaigns and openly acknowledge various, cultural recognition days, which are all important aspects of this work. But if we do not see ourselves as the root of the change we want to see and are openly committing to this, then prepare for status quo, right? What I'm asking all of you here today is to take empowered action and decide if, as of today, right, what you're going to do. Are you going to start working towards really building an equitable, diverse, and inclusive space, or are you not? Because the truth is, you cannot be a little bit for this work. You can't make slight changes and expect big outcomes, right? You can minimally engage in dialogue. This work requires your full commitment. Does that mean change is instantaneous? Not at all, right? In fact, again, depending on where you are, where you are as an organization, you might actually need to spend time unlearning and undoing before you start to bring in these important pieces, right? Right? The work of this, of EDI, it takes time and it needs to be spent with intention, right? Assessing those places, those spaces, those things and people that may be barriers to our progress, so that we can now begin the process of taking empowered action and really building equitable, diverse, and inclusive spaces. You know, I've been doing this work for a long time, and it's hard work. This work can be triggering. It can absolutely bring up feelings and emotions that we've worked really hard to put in that pretty little box in the corner. But to stay competitive, to stay relevant, and to make the kind of impact that I really believe all of you are in this space to do so, requires that this work be implemented as part of the way you do business, right? And so as a closing exercise, I want you to take a minute or two and identify your commitment effective today, right? How will you take empowered action actively and contribute to an equitable, diverse, and inclusive space, right? As we leave this space today, you know, I want to leave you with an understanding that this work is not checkbox work, right? But is work that is required at all levels of your organizations, at the personal level, right? It is easy to stand back and look at the structures and systems and look at the leadership team or the board or executives and say, if these changes were to happen, then all would be well. But the truth is, that's not actually just the case. Every single person in this room plays an active role in the conditions by which your organizations move forward. Again, not just in the space of equity, diversity, and inclusion, but in the overall success of your organization, right? And so again, you know, being mindful of time with 1 minute to spare, because I always am mindful of people's time, right? I want to take this opportunity to thank you for your time, right? For your attention and for your commitment and your willingness to do this work, right? I know it's not easy, and sometimes it may feel like things aren't moving fast enough, but systemic and cultural change is like a tortoise, right? It may be slow and perhaps might not be as flashy, but it makes a statement, and more importantly, it reflects sustainable change. And with that, I want to thank you all for the opportunity to be here today. I will stop sharing my screen so that I can actually see faces. That's always the hardest part of presentations, when you share a screen, you don't get to see people's faces. I don't know if there's any, I know there's only, actually we've hit the mark, it's 3 o'clock. But I don't know if there's any questions, any comments. My pleasure, Sheila, thank you.
That was awesome, Aisha. Thank you so much for sharing that presentation with us today.
Thank you.
Again, we'll open the floor up to presentations, whether you're directly on Zoom or in Hoover, to Aisha.
There's always the awkward pause where someone's like, I'm going to ask the
question. I know for myself, I'm very much looking forward to continuing that conversation with all you awesome coaches and sport administrators out there. And as the work gets started with, based on the conversation that Aisha just led us, by all means, reach out. We can definitely continue this conversation and continue this important work.
My pleasure. I'm looking at the comments. Absolutely. I'm always here to ignite that fire. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Such a pleasure. Thank you. Yep, growth mindset. That's right, Darren.
So before we go, just a couple of housekeeping items. By all means, we can still have time for questions as well. But before we go, a couple of things. First off, for those attending the sessions here at the Sports Center this evening, please arrive to the turnstiles by 5:45, and our team will meet you out there to bring you back to our offices. For those joining us in person tomorrow, friendly reminder that things get started at 8:30 sharp. So please feel, we'll have coffee on the go and some snacks and whatnot. So please feel free to show up in any beers between 8 and 8:30, and we'll get started right at 8:30 sharp. We do have one question from Judy. Judy
Yes.
says, equity is so crucial. Do you have any suggestions on how to make that part of your culture without that being perceived as a microaggression in itself?
So I think one of the cool things that an organization can do, and I know, again, in doing this work, I've seen quite a few organizations doing it. They're starting their own, say, equity, diversity, and inclusive committees, right, internally. So what this does is it ensures that you have, good representation again, being mindful of the fact that not just visual representation, right, but understanding all the intersectionality of people that can come together and start exploring, like, what are small things that we can do to demonstrate our commitment to this, right? Because you're right, certainly what often happens is an organization makes a commitment, and then there's this expectation that, people are just going to be satisfied with the fact that we said we're doing it. But how do you actually invoke existing champions within your organization, or people who have knowledge, who've done this work maybe outside in their communities, that can really help to shape what creating an equitable space looks like? So, if you haven't yet established an equity diversity, committee, I know Andrew, again, is somebody I would encourage you to reach out to. Explore what that can do, right? What is equity? Because equity is understood very differently, to different people, right? But I would say that might be one of the first ways that you could really start to understand how to mobilize change and get people involved, so that it's not one perspective that is now bringing these ideas forward. But again, there's diversity and ideas that can be shared to create some change within the organization.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was a fantastic question, by the way.
Yes, it was. It was. Thank you, Judy.
Sheila talks about bringing this education to our schools and to our school-age children. Definitely an important piece as well.
Absolutely.
And like I said, I fully admit there's an element of this is a shameless plug in here, but by all means, like Aisha said, this conversation doesn't end with this presentation. This conversation continues. And by all means, if you want to continue this conversation, my virtual door in our office door here is always open to continue that conversation. And if you see me roaming the halls tomorrow, by all means, feel free to tap me on the shoulder, or social distance, tap me on the shoulder, and we can continue this conversation for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, leverage the resources that you have, and again, if I can add, I don't want to call it a shameless plug for Andrew, but when you have champions within your organizations or externally that are able to mobilize, capitalize. Right, capitalize, and also see like who is within your organizations, again, that have the capacity and the willingness to do this and want to champion this work. You'd be surprised what people can really do when given a little bit of autonomy and opportunity to shine. So
awesome. Well, thank you again, Aisha.
Thank you
everybody for participating. We look forward to seeing you, whether it's this evening or whether it's tomorrow, or perhaps it's virtual tomorrow. We look forward to having you join the rest of our comments. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Have a great day, everyone. Happy Friday.